Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here, the most creative music critic on the entirety of the internet, and I was just pondering the other day about the fact that I invented music, but I invented so much music that I don't really have time to talk about it all in a single week, at least not in the form of full-length videos. I mean, I try to do 6 to 8 album reviews, usually 6 per week, but, sometimes that just straight up doesn't happen, and I mean, that's just kind of a thing that's bound to occur. But I still do listen to more than I ultimately review on the channel, and as such, I decided to do what I've always been known to do. Be the most original person I know, you guys. And that means starting a new series that, frankly, no one has ever done anything like before. This is groundbreaking material. I'm going to start a series called the Rapid Record Recap, where I talk about all the albums that I've heard in a month that I want to talk about, but I don't have enough time to do videos on it. Just pretty unique. Your Anthony Fantanos and your Mike the Snares. Get them out of here. I may have been on this planet for half the time that they've been alive, but I did it first. They'd be nothing without me. And also, I just end up listening to a lot of new music every month that I enjoy or I really dislike that I just never really get the chance to talk about for one reason or another. And I mean, hey, if it takes on originality for me to be able to do that, then so be it. So, without further ado, to kind of begin my recap of the entire year up to this point, here is the January, February, and March edition of the Rapid Record Recap of 2023. Iggy Pop, Every Loser. I won't lie, Iggy has been putting out some weirdly decent stuff at this point in his career, at least compared to a lot of his contemporaries that are still making music decades after they first debuted in the alternative music / punk / whatever you want to call Iggy Pop in general scene. And, I mean, you know what? Every Loser is more of the same. Don't get me wrong, it has its flaws. For example, producer Andrew Watt has a very clean and shiny production style that greatly suits pop artists that he works with, like Ellie Goulding and Dua Lipa, but not really so much someone who needs a bit more raw energy like Iggy Pop. And admittedly, the mixing on a couple tracks here, like Strung Out Johnny, is not necessarily the best, with some of Pop's vocals being a bit too low and a bit too hidden under these dense walls of synthetic instrumentation. That being said, some of the tracks here, like The Regency and Frenzy, are actually pretty frantic and highly energetic cuts that see Iggy Pop doing what he does best, which is just being an absolute maniac behind the mic. This isn't a great album by any means. In fact, it's a nearly mediocre album at times, but with that in mind, I do genuinely feel like this is one worth checking out if you do like Iggy Pop. I mean, sure, it's not going to be for everybody, but hey, he's approaching his 80s, and this is better than I think the vast majority of what his peers could pull off today. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. Nicole Dollanganger, Married in Mount Airy. Similar to Dollanganger's previous records, like 2015's Natural Born Losers, for example, this is just fine. It exists, I'll give it that. A lot of it just feels like pretty run-of-the-mill slowcore as far as the actual compositions go, and the songwriting feels a bit vague, even though it is a conceptual album in nature. It feels like it's kind of not a lot, generally speaking. The childlike, whispery vocals of Dollanganger are actually pretty appealing upon first glance and have the potential to save what would be an otherwise completely forgettable record, but unfortunately her lack of actual range really does hold her back. I mean, her voice suits the record for a track or two, sure, but after a while you realize that that's really the only vocal style that she's going to be working with throughout the entire record, and then when you pair that with the pretty singular sound of the actual sonic aesthetics here, and you just have a pretty monotonous and uninteresting listen. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. Asian Glow and sonhos tomam conta, Dream Glow. This is a collaboration, as you may have been able to tell, between South Korean artist Asian Glow and Brazilian artist sonhos tomam conta, and it's pretty intriguing in nature. There's a fairly distinct brand that comes with each half of the collaboration, and it's pretty exciting to see those get combined overall with a pretty dense and well-executed sound. That being said, I would also make the argument that maybe they blend together a bit too much here. I mean, Asian Glow and sonhos tomam conta can be two of the most exciting artists within indie music in general at the moment at their very best, and here they feel like a bit of a gray blob, just sort of mismatched together. It just doesn't really feel like a proper collaboration per se. Each half of the duo isn't really defined in their own respective way, and while it does feel like that was kind of the creative intent here, it doesn't really work out in the way that I would personally hope it would. I'd also like to point out how easy it is to appreciate some of the more ferocious political commentary and general content on this record on tracks like Hang Them All, which ends up primarily criticizing South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol, and for that I have to kind of admire what this EP is doing, even if I'm not totally in love with everything that's going on here musically and even conceptually, but nonetheless, it becomes a decent EP solely because of the fact that it has a lot of passion behind it, and it's hard not to admire that, even if, again, it doesn't really come across as successful as other things that both respective artists in this collab have done in the past. I'm going to give this EP 3 stars out of 5. Catherine Mercy's Self-Titled. I actually had really high hopes for this one. It just didn't really land the way that I was kind of hoping it would, unfortunately. I mean, the longer tracks like Catherine Destroyer and December feel like they just drag on a bit too long and really overstay their welcome, while some of the shorter tracks are relatively unmemorable with a shoegaze adjacent sound that I personally find to just be a little bit tired at this point within the realm of underground music, and even a quiet commotion feature that's actually pretty good can't save this one from being all that distinct in a crowd of, again, dense, layered, shoegaze-esque indie singer-songwriter projects. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. Oedipus Apartment Complex, The Blissful Sounds of Miracula. The Blissful Sounds of Miracula is the latest studio album from Spanish electronic project the Oedipus Apartment Complex, and I have to admit I was actually pretty excited going into this record. It's got lovely cover art, some interesting track titles. My point is, it kind of sank its hooks into me before I even listened to it, and I was pretty excited to give it a go. And what I was given was an incredibly uninteresting album that just sounds like a series of royalty-free, semi-minimalistic electronic tracks that really have no sense of cohesion from song to song, and it just so happens that the rest of the record feels textureless, it feels dull, it feels emotionless, and the compositions themselves aren't even that interesting to analyze from a more technical standpoint. It's just a below-average record that, frankly, is extremely disappointing. I'm going to give this record 2 stars out of 5. Youngboy Never Broke Again, I Rest My Case. Honestly, it's just another Youngboy record, and if you know, you know. The guy has energy for days, I have to give him that, but unfortunately the majority of the record, both in terms of his flow and in terms of the instrument, the guy has energy for days, I have to give him that, but as far as the actual instrumentation goes, as far as his songwriting goes, as far as his actual performance work and general flow and presence on the record goes, Youngboy feels like the culmination of a bunch of recycled sounds that are far from rare in the ongoing rage scene, and I mean really that's not necessarily a bad thing, and there are some genuinely catchy songs on here, such as Swag on Point, as well as Red, but generally speaking, this record is forgettable, but also utterly harmless, so do with that information what you will. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. Obituary, Dying of Everything. Obituary are metal legends, no question, and no real second thought there. I mean, Obituary are legendary through and through, and right now it seems like they're trying to hop on the bandwagon of classic death metal band who releases one of their best albums to date in a very surprising fashion, in the same way that bands like Immolation and Cannibal Corpse, among many others, have done over the course of the past couple years, but really, Obituary's legendary status does not mean everything they do is perfect, and this record is pretty much a solid demonstration of that. The instrumentals are relatively fine, and the album opener Barely Alive is actually pretty great and seems to promise vicious things for the rest of the record, but really everything just kind of suffers in a variety of ways. The production especially is pretty weak, as a lot of the album feels muffled in comparison to prior Obituary albums, especially the vocal work of John Tardy, which is a real shame because he's a fantastic vocalist, and it's sad to hear him really put under the weight of different instrumentals, different guitar riffs, and the general suppression that comes with the production style found on this album. That being said, it's still a pretty fun, simplistic meat-and-potatoes death metal album for people such as myself that enjoy that kind of sound. Just don't go checking this one out if you're looking for something really fresh and impressive sounding. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. Margo Price, Strays. Margo Price has fallen pretty far since her excellent 2016 album Midwest Farmer's Daughter, and really Strays is just a further bit of proof of her downfall. I mean, what once was a genuinely heartfelt artist is now a woman that is putting out pretty cookie-cutter Americana with mediocre songwriting that just kind of screams, I grew up in mildly rural Illinois, and well, I don't know if you know anything about mildly rural Illinois, but there aren't a lot of interesting stories to tell for the most part. She was once a really strong lyricist, and it's a shame to see her putting out songwriting that just feels pretty, again, run-of-the-mill, and the instrumentals are just kind of synthetic. Her vocal work is only mildly phoned in, and generally speaking, this album just doesn't feel as punchy or as poignant as anything else that she has done in the past, and really, she's been kind of falling off for a while at this point. I mean, it's a serious shame to see her go from a great storyteller and deeply personal songwriter to, again, just a pretty run-of-the-mill Americana songwriter. And that isn't to mention that the instrumentals are pretty average overall. I wouldn't really call them synthetic per se, but they definitely are unremarkable. And her vocal work is only mildly phoned in, so there's that at least. I mean, look, Strays isn't bad, and you may like it way more than I do, but again, to me, it just comes across as, again, run-of-the-mill Americana, and nothing more than that. Callie Malone, Does Spring Hide Its Joy? It's an interesting drone-based epic, and I quite like it, generally speaking. I mean, similar to Callie Malone's previous work, the primary intention of the record generally seems to be exploring how far minimalism can go in creating an ever-evolving and lush world while still remaining bare bones in those same exact roots that minimalism is based in, and I would say it does so successfully. Stephen O'Malley's guitar work is interesting, as is Lisa Railton's cello performance, and I will say that V2 and V3 of the composition do feel a little bit lacking in comparison to V1, which I feel comes across as a little more expansive, generally speaking, but nonetheless, I still think it's a pretty impressive album. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Katatonia, Sky Void of Stars. Sky Void of Stars is the latest studio album from ex-doom metal fusion icons turned full-time alternative metal band Katatonia, and hey, it's not bad. The instrumental tones here are a bit too clean overall. I would have personally liked to have heard a little bit more grit behind some of the guitar work, or even the drum work, for example, but as a whole, I would also say that there are enough strong melodies and memorable climaxes to different songs here that feel worth actually checking out. I mean, Katatonia is kind of 50-50 at this point, so just to hear something that's pretty solid but not great from them is nice enough to hear. And you know what, maybe this really isn't the greatest thing in the world compared to other alt-metal records out there today. Maybe there isn't a ton to it in comparison to some of its contemporaries, but nonetheless, I think that this is a strong effort from Katatonia, and if they just release this album like 50 more times in the future, which God knows they won't because they can't keep a single sound for more than a handful of albums, I would really have no complaints. This is nice. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. Trippie Redd, Mansion Music. Trippie Redd has had a pretty unique career up to this point, as he's kind of constantly bounced between being a pretty heavily pop-based and arguably rage-based MC to going into a more experimental side of things, including the 2021 Travis Barker pop-punk collaboration Neon Shark vs. Pegasus. But unfortunately, a number of different qualities from record to record have held Trippie back from actually making, fun music, which I'm assuming is ultimately the goal. I will say, first things first, Chief Keef does make some great decisions as executive producer of this album, as do the other producers that have managed to latch onto the record, but that's about the only redeemable quality of Mansion Music. The rest is just not great. Most of the features here are predictable and just fall flat. That includes, for example, Kodak Black or Ski Mask the Slump God on Toilet Water, one of the major lowlights of the record, and even some of the seemingly interesting picks here, like Travis Scott and Lil B to have on as features, ended up disappointing, as it's far from their best work. In fact, it's actually one of the weakest features that Travis has done in recent years, which is saying something because, well, he's never been a great features dude, if I'm being totally honest. That isn't to mention how Mansion Music runs for nearly an hour and 20 minutes, and that just isn't acceptable when Trippie Redd himself is just not exciting enough of a performer to warrant that kind of length for an album. I mean, Mansion Music doesn't even warrant 50 minutes, let alone 77, but here we are. This is almost the length of a feature film, and it has absolutely nothing to say creatively or artistically. Mansion Music is just a mess of a record that happens to have good production behind it for the most part, at least, and ultimately that just means that while it isn't the worst thing in the world, it's also another weak entry in the Trippie Redd catalog, which is made up of pretty much nothing but weak entries. I'm going to give this record 1.5 stars out of 5. Maneskin, Rush. This sounds like every single, mainstream commercial radio rock band just condensed into a singular group, and I mean that in a bad way. That being said, the overwhelmingly negative reception that this record has received is maybe a little bit much. I mean, don't get me wrong, it is a terrible record. Let me just go on the record, I do not enjoy this album in the slightest. It is a bad album. But I also think that people are being a bit overdramatic. I mean, there are some slightly almost but not quite redeeming qualities here. You can tell the band are having fun, even if the songs themselves are aggressively unremarkable. It certainly doesn't help that Maneskin as a band just feel hugely unoriginal, almost Greta Van Fleet levels of unoriginal. And really, that just does not help their case in the slightest when they're doing song after song of just same fist-pumping rock and roll anthems. The worst of them probably being the track Cool Kids, where they try to make it seem like they're the cool kids, and then they call out genres like trap and pop for being music made and listened by cool kids, but they aren't the cool kids. Maneskin are the cool kids, and people just don't realize that, which is really hilarious and slightly ironic considering trap and pop have some of the most innovative musicians on the entire planet right now. Meanwhile, Maneskin sound like they're doing their best to just appeal to every single possible 13-year-old that just started listening to the Smashing Pumpkins. Actually, I take that back. I'm sorry for comparing any band to another band that has Billy Corgan in it. 13-year-old that just started listening to Nirvana. Hey, there you go. That's a band I respect. I mean, really, this is just a annoying record above all else. I wouldn't even call it especially horrible or anything like that. Really, if anything, Maneskin just sound like a band that was, formed by your little cousins whose entire taste in music is based around boring boomer rock bands like Aerosmith and incredibly surface-level alternative rock bands like Muse and Pearl Jam, and because of that, they think that they're the coolest people to ever live in the history of the entire planet. That's really the best way I can describe this album. It's unoriginal, it's dull, it's insipid, it's boring, but also there are worse things in the world. That being said, this album is straight up terrible, though, in its own way. I'm going to give this record 1.5 stars out of 5. Ice Spice, Like. I made a joke about this on Twitter when it first came out, saying that I wasn't going to review it for mental health purposes, and then I actually forgot to review it, so now I'm, kind of concerned that anybody that saw that tweet just thinks that I was in, a really bad place mentally. I wasn't, I just didn't want to listen to Ice Spice. But hey, I actually finally did, and you know what, it's pretty decent. I shouldn't have judged a book by its cover. It's a good EP. It isn't the best thing in the world, and the track Actin' a Smooshy is not the best. It's kind of mediocre, if I'm being totally honest. But at the same time, some of the more odd, left-field, weird things being done here are some of the more successful tracks. I mean, the SpongeBob influence of Bikini Bottom, or Ice Spice's generally monotonous flow and style, it kind of comes together in, a weird way. It shouldn't work at all, and it doesn't on paper, but in actual practice, it's pretty good. While Ice Spice's staying power really has yet to be seen, and that's really something I won't be able to comment on for some time at this point, if I'm being totally honest, I also do think that this EP probably offers more than you would expect. I mean, I know I'm months late of reviewing this now, so you probably already listened to it and know that, but hey, I'm telling it to you now, so in case you haven't heard it, there you go. I'm going to give this EP 3 stars out of 5. Kimbra, A Reckoning. After putting out some incredibly well-executed synth pop over the course of her past few releases, it is very, very disappointing to see Kimbra just sort of retreat into this below-average, very sterile-sounding brand of alt-pop R&B fusion. It went from really solid to even great synthy pop music to just boring so quickly. I mean, A Reckoning is forgettable at best and dreadfully boring in its worst moments. This is the musical equivalent of the color beige, and I don't even mean that in like a good, like, you painted a room beige in your house, kind of way. Like, that's not a bad beige. I just mean literally just you are forced to look at the color beige for like a little bit less than an hour of your life, and you can do nothing else. That is the equivalent of this record. That makes sense, trust me. If I'm being totally honest, this album would actually probably just be purely mediocre and completely unmemorable if it weren't for some features here that are genuinely bad. Some poor features from people like Eric the Architect that don't fit on the record and just feel stiff and unprepared. And generally speaking, they drag down what is already an uneventful and really just not good album. I'm going to give this record 2 stars out of 5. Fudged up. One day. Haha, can't get me now, YouTube. This is just solid post-hardcore that happens to have some particularly strong melodies. I mean, it's not groundbreaking or really even that unique in the grand scheme of modern, more accessible post-hardcore records, but it's still very enjoyable. Damian Abraham's vocal work is pretty strong throughout the entirety of the record, and most of the more anthemic moments end up working out pretty well and actually feel fairly fitting, which is something that not a lot of records like this can consistently pull off successfully. And I also like how the topic of toxic masculinity and its development is brought into the limelight on the track Broken Little Boys, which is far and away the best song on the entirety of the album. And look, it's not the best album ever made or anything like that, but I think it's a very solid record and highly recommendable for people really into catchy melodic indie rock that also want maybe a little bit more edge than the average album that they may experience. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. Dean Blunt, Give Me a Moment. This is the latest EP from the great Dean Blunt, and it was released so subtly that you may not even know that it came out unless you're aware of Dean or you're like a pretty big fan of his. I digress. This is a great, highly recommendable EP. It sees Dean taking 7 minutes to just knock out 5 songs that feel very emotionally raw and filled with melancholy, but still fully realized in terms of composition. The sampling here is pretty interesting as well. Obviously, the very brief runtime of this EP makes it pretty limited, but still, it's not every day that you hear the Smiths being sampled on something, but that's exactly what happens on the song Over Him, where the classic Smiths tune Pretty Girls Make Graves is sampled on there. It's an intriguing thing, and it really does develop a more unique sense of identity for the EP, something that's definitely hard to pull off considering, again, it's in single digits as far as the minutes of runtime. As a whole, this is another unique and, generally speaking, excellent release in the great Dean Blunt discography. I mean, you just gotta listen to it, but there's not a lot more I can say. I'm going to give this EP 3.5 stars out of 5. Young Fathers, Heavy Heavy. It's Young Fathers. It's weird, it's artsy, it's psychedelic, it's tribal, it's got R&B influences, it's pretty much impossible to describe. It's very, very hard to get into at all. But it's also very impressive. So, I mean, yeah, Young Fathers. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Jonatan Leandor, 96. Sugar World. This is a pretty solid singer-songwriter record from Jonatan Leandor, aka Young Lean, who, you might have heard of him. Pretty notable guy. The more glam-based influences here are pretty interesting to me, and although there are some adult contemporary sounds on certain tracks that I just cannot get behind, I think that the vast majority of the record is good, and when it's good, it's very good, especially on songs like Blue Light and If I'm Born I Have to Live, which really see him mastering the respective sounds of bittersweet singer-songwriter-isms and garagey glam rock, respectively. It may not be a perfect record, but I still think it's a pretty interesting experiment for him. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. RAYE, My 21st Century Blues. The story of RAYE's record label troubles is really too much for me to explain here, so just here is the basic rundown. She signed to a record label, major record label at that, got the chance to release her album, created My 21st Century Blues, then waited several years, 7 years to be exact, while she wasn't allowed to release that album while still under contract with that exact record label. My point is, she's been screwed over by the music industry enough to immediately deserve everybody's attention when she finally does release an album. Then cue her finally getting the chance to release it, then cue it dropping this past February, then cue it being great. She's great vocally, she's extremely charismatic, and the songwriting that she delivers on tracks like Escapism and Body Dysmorphia are extremely heartfelt and personal to a huge extent, actually. It really feels like you're getting an inner look into the mind of RAYE throughout the vast majority of the songwriting on My 21st Century Blues, and that isn't to mention the certain theatricality about the entire record that suits everything that she does vocally, as well as everything that she does artistically and aesthetically. I think that, as a whole, this is an extremely cohesive album with a lot of interesting ideas, and all of them are executed pretty much as perfectly as they could be. This is a really great album, and while I am deeply sorry and empathetic towards RAYE for having to wait so long to actually get this work out there into the world, and even more really sympathetic towards the fact that despite being on a label, she had to release it semi-independently, ultimately I'm glad that it's just out in the general public now, and that's something that people can hear, because really this is a triumph of an artist that, again, was really just screwed over repeatedly by the music industry, despite the content of their actual final work being genuinely phenomenal. This is a must-hear pop/R&B album for the entirety of the year. I'm going to give this record 4 stars out of 5. In Flames, Foregone. In Flames, one of the most polarizing major metal bands in the history of the genre, to not be polarizing for being horrible people, at least. After putting out some of the most beloved and iconic melodic death metal albums of all time, I'm talking about records like The Jester Race and Clayman, they just tarnished their legacy by going in this sort of alternative metal direction and putting out albums like Soundtrack to Your Escape, before really just hitting an all-time bottom-of-the-barrel level low with Battles in 2016, far and away their worst album, and arguably one of the worst hard rock/metal adjacent records of the entirety of the 2010s. And here we are with another album, and it's a slight improvement, but that's kind of like saying that getting punched in the face is better than being stabbed in the face. Like, yeah, that's a given, but I feel like that there could have been something a lot better going on here. I mean, In Flames still sounds flat with production that is so incredibly monotonous and wall of sound-esque that the entirety of the record just feels one note and generally lacking in dynamics, while the band's influences range from melodic death metal to the more alternative metal sounds that they've become more associated with in recent memory, and the melodic death metal moments are fine, I guess, really mediocre as they don't even remotely hold a candle to some of their better moments in that field, and the more alternative metal influences are as weak as ever. They still sound like your average corporate radio rock, truck commercial music kind of sound. It's just obnoxious in the worst way, and I won't call this the worst album ever made or anything like that. There are obviously worse examples of, again, like corporate hard rock bands trying to sound cool when in fact they sound wildly uninteresting and wildly unoriginal, but nonetheless, In Flames, obviously trying to make a stride towards, getting in people's good graces again, but not working here, so far at least. I'm going to give this record 2 stars out of 5. Pierce the Veil, The Jaws of Life. I'll always think that Pierce the Veil are a solid emo pop-influenced post-hardcore band, but unfortunately their latest record just doesn't really do it. The album opening 2 tracks, Death of an Executioner and Past the Nirvana, are actually very well performed and pretty solid tracks overall, but then it's just downhill from there as the band sound a little less passionate as the record goes on, while they lean into some of their more synth-based and in turn synthetic influences, which just come across as unnatural. Plus there's Chloe Moriando's feature on 12 Fractures, which just doesn't fit in the song, and it feels like she recorded it on her laptop and then just sent it into the band and they just stuffed it into an already finished song. It's not a bad album per se, but it does have a lot of flaws, and in the end it's just not something worth returning to. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. Avey Tare, Sevens. Sevens is the latest solo drop from Animal Collective member Avey Tare, and hey, it's nice. A lot of people, understandably, aren't fans of dense neo-psychedelia albums that don't really have a lot to say in terms of reinventing psychedelic as a sonic aesthetic in the same way that Seven is, but at the same time, I'm not one of those people. I love psychedelia of any kind, and I'm willing to give any of it a shot, and I happen to really like Sevens as well. The record is textured very nicely, it has some solid vocal work, some solid melodies at times, and there's some pleasantly incorporated folktronica influences throughout the entirety of the record that give the entire thing a bit of a unique flair as Avey continues to develop himself as an artist away from Animal Collective, which is nice to see because although solo projects from Animal Collective have not been a rare thing over the course of the past couple of decades, it's still nice to see one of their members continuing to really find their own sound and identity away from the collective. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Screaming Females, Desire Pathway. Screaming Females are perhaps one of the more underestimated indie rock bands out there at the moment, and with this album following up their excellent 2018 effort All at Once, I gotta say that I had some pretty high expectations for this album, and they were all met for the most part. Some of the best Screaming Female songs to date are found here on Desire Pathway. A really perfect balance of polish and rawness is struck on this record. Meanwhile, you have a lot of great hooks, melodies, and choruses that are pretty catchy and fairly distinct overall, while you have the fact that the album continues to really develop itself more and more as the tracklist goes on, leading to some of the best Screaming Female songs that I personally remember ever hearing, like Ornament and Titan, appearing towards the end of the record, or at least on its back half. This record might not really strike your interest or blow you away if you're an indie rock fan that's been around the block a time or two, but nonetheless, I really do feel like Desire Pathway has some great songs on it and is probably one of the best Screaming Female albums that we've seen so far. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Pigs, 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 Land of Sleeper. Hey, if you want proof that great stoner metal still exists, then here it is. The band's name may be obnoxiously long, but the music is casually great. Matt Beatty is a colossal musical presence as the band's vocalist, the instrumentation feels dense but still relatively accessible, and the atmosphere is, again, accessible but still dense and oppressive enough that it manages to maintain a huge degree of relevancy and credibility within the current realm of heavier music. Needless to say, it isn't really hard to see why and how this band in particular is going on to seemingly become one of the definitive stoner bands of the 2020s. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Wesley Joseph, Glow. I hate to say it because I expected to really enjoy this one, but it's just boring above all else. These dark R&B influences that the record has don't really have a lot of impact when there are so many other artists right now doing the exact same sound in the same niche, but so much better and in a so much more interesting manner. And the rap verses are pretty solid, but they are few and far between, and the actual lyricism that Joseph puts forward about things like, dealing with grief and life and maturing, while not vague, don't really feel like they're that powerful or striking in any way. Again, it's not like he's indescriptive about how he's actually discussing things, it's just that he doesn't feel like he has a particularly unique viewpoint on things. Glow is a record with solid performances and some interesting ideas, but just enough creative missteps to really cancel all of those out immediately, and that doesn't mean it's a bad record by any means, but it also means that it's just not one worth revisiting. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. Despite the fact that, generally speaking, it actually met some pretty warm reception earlier this year, Skrillex's comeback album, Quest for Fire, felt very dated to me, which is why I was also not a fan of Skrillex, Don't Get Too Close. Whereas Quest for Fire was just simply boring and uninteresting to me, Don't Get Too Close is violently 2015 in regards to its sound, at least. It's just not great. The features here range from bad, like Justin Bieber and Don Toliver on Don't Let Go, to barely decent, such as Blade on Real Spring, and there are even some songs and moments on here that I would call downright rancid, honestly. Songs like the disturbingly clunky title track, or moments like the cringe-inducing hook of "You're bad for my health, you're bad for my wealth" on the song Bad For Me. It's just terrible. Everything about this album perfectly captures what was wrong with mainstream EDM a decade ago, except it's 2023. That is a bad thing. But hey, you know what? I'll give Skrillex credit. He made his own take on a DJ Khaled album. You gotta give the man credit. It takes some serious balls to make something this ridiculously lame. So, you know? I'm going to give this record 1.5 stars out of 5. Algiers. Shook. I absolutely love this album on paper. I mean, there are tons of incredibly talented featured artists on this record, and not for nothing, but Algiers are a pretty solid band, despite not being a personal favorite of mine. I mean, this record should be just a home run on paper, but it's not. Plus, the general concept behind Shook is for Algiers, a relatively experimental band, to invite other very experimental and creative musicians to collaborate with them on this record, for everyone to be able to showcase their talents, and that happens, but nothing is done with it. It's frustrating. The only absolute standout track here is Bite Back, and that has nothing to do with Algiers. It's just because Billy Woods and Backwash are on it together, two of the greatest rappers of the entire modern-day alternative rap scene. And other than that, really there aren't a lot of real major highlights on Shook, when in reality the entire album should just be one long highlight based on the concept alone. It's not a bad album by any means. In fact, there's actually more decent material than there is weak material. There are some slight highlights here, like 73% and A Good Man, but generally speaking, there's this certain suspenseful atmosphere from track to track that feels like it should be molded into something bigger than it ultimately becomes. It's a lack of energy, it's a lack of utilization of the immense talents that were brought to the table for the sake of this record, and it's just the fact that there are frankly too many spoken word passages that ultimately disrupt the entire run of the album, that it just doesn't become something larger than what it actually ultimately ends up being. Nonetheless, it's still fine, but it could have been a lot more. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. US Girls, Bless This Mess. Meg Remy really did a great thing in 2018, releasing the record In a Poem United, as it was an excellent album. It really stood out for that entire year of singer-songwriter-ish music, and then she started to fall off a little bit, and then she fell off a little more, and a little more, and a little more, and a little more, and now we're here. Bless This Mess is Remy doing just a terrible impression of 80s synthy pop funk in the same vein as Sign of the Times era Prince. In fact, a lot of the record directly lifts in a very derivative manner from the 80s Minneapolis sound, which Prince, among other artists, helped pioneer. And for that, you need a certain level of charisma, a certain level of sensuality in your voice, and frankly, Meg Remy just has neither of those. There's also the instrumentals themselves, which feel like a corny Spinal Tap-esque take on the aforementioned style, with a lot of different sounds here coming across as presets from something like Cakewalk or another beginner music creation service or some other sort of program, something that you would never ever want to use for a professionally released record like this unless you seriously have the know-how to make it not sound synthetic, something which Meg Remy obviously does not have on this album because, unfortunately, Bless This Mess is just a mess. Look, I'm not gonna, tiptoe my way around it or anything like that. I genuinely think that this is a terrible record with little to no redeemable qualities about it, which is why I'm going to give this record 1 star out of 5. Yeat, Afterlyfe. Look, Yeat is an alright rapper, but man, he needs to change up his sound, because this record, Afterlyfe, sounds suspiciously like one song and then just 21 songs that are, remarkably similar to that one song. It doesn't help that there are only 4 tracks with features on this record, meaning that Yeat is sort of forced to carry his own weight the vast majority of the time, and Yeat just doesn't have the charisma or personality to do that. I won't say that Afterlyfe is a distressingly bad record or anything like that. It's not the worst thing in the world, but I feel like this could have been a lot better if many different things were changed about it, ranging from Yeat changing up his style and flow for once in his career, to more features being added, so Yeat is not forced to pull his own weight the entirety of the record, for the most part at least. And also, cut down on the length of the record. I mean, really, this album does not need to be round about 70 minutes long. Nobody asked for a Yeat album to be that long. I'm going to give this record 2 stars out of 5. Miss Grit, Follow the Cyborg. This album's cover art and title, generally speaking, is very fitting in my eyes, as Follow the Cyborg really does feel like a robot, cyborg, or any other sort of AI managed to gain self-awareness and general sentience, and then just proceeded to not do anything, and then just made a really good electronic-influenced indie pop rock record for some reason. I don't know why AI would, do that and not take over the world, but hey, this is preferable. The entire listening experience feels mechanical and at times almost mathematical, but at the same time, there's enough humanity really shining through here to make for a natural listening experience, and Sinking is just an absolutely beautiful album closer, easily one of the best album closing tracks I've heard of any album this year so far. It's quick, it's compact, it's a brief listen, but it's also something that is more than worth your time if you are even remotely interested in mildly experimental and artsy pop music. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. The God Fahim, Iron Bull. And it's a solid Fahim album, once again, to the surprise of pretty much nobody that's been following him for an extended period of time, probably. I mean, the dude's got an interesting presence, an intentionally stiff delivery style, if you will, and I generally think that he's an intriguing persona and figure in the ongoing abstract hip-hop scene. There's also some pretty great features here from extremely talented rappers like Makami and Yoral Droog. I just wish that the album was longer than 23 minutes. Plus, I feel like some of the instrumentals are a bit understated, which is a shame because the sort of southern abstract boom bap fusion that's going on here is pretty interesting to me from a creative standpoint. I just think it's a bit disappointing that doesn't get to shine more, even if really Fahim and all of his co-conspirators are doing some great work over top of them. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. Haken, Fauna. And the award for rock album that I am most deeply conflicted about potentially goes to this record. This is not a bad album by any means, and there are some pretty challenging ideas here, such as the synthesizer usage in tracks like The Alphabet of Me that are pulled off pretty well, but just pretty well. For the most part, this is your average prog rock metal in 2023 kind of record, and it doesn't really stand out too much. It's not mediocre, it's just decent, except that would just be it if it weren't for the 11-minute track Elephants, which is amazing. The full title of the song is actually Elephants Never Forget, and it just sort of channels this 80s King Crimson avant-prog style that is just pulled off so incredibly well here. And honestly, if the full album was nothing but that, I feel like there would be a legitimate chance for it to land on my favorite albums of the year at the end of the year, but it's just one song. An 11-minute long song that doesn't waste a single one of those minutes, but it's just one song nonetheless, and it's a shame because I feel like if Haken explored that direction more, they would easily be a definitive prog band of this era. It manages to really harken back to the older 80s era of avant-prog, but still manages to feel grounded in modern-day reality with a really fresh take on this great sound. I digress, the album itself is still decent, and there are some interesting ideas on virtually every single song here. I just really hope that they continue to go more in the direction of Elephants Never Forget as time progresses, because that is far and away the highlight of this album, and potentially the highlight of any album that Haken have ever put out, actually. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. Macklemore, Ben. Oh boy, where do I start with this one? Look, all in all, Macklemore is pretty harmless. I think that the general consensus is that he's a harmless dude at this point. Not that he's really making good music or anything like that, but that he's not putting out the most rancid work in the entire world, and he's just kind of doing his thing on his own, and that's totally fine. And you know what? I even admire some of the stuff that he's doing on Ben. The way that he's trying to touch on a variety of topics deeply personal to him, from drug addiction to personal heartbreaks to, maturing and growing in adulthood, having a kid and stuff like that. I admire all of that, but it's all executed terribly. The production is just flat, and the beats, for the most part, are synthetic, which is nothing new for Mac, if I'm being totally honest. Really, the only instrumental here that's actually worthwhile is the DJ Premier beat on the song Heroes, and that's only because it's done by DJ Premier. I mean, the dude is a legend within the music industry for a reason. Even a Macklemore song can have a great beat if it's done by DJ Premier. I also think it's really ironic how there's a bit on the song Lost where Macklemore talks about rappers saying a lot but not saying anything important, when he also has strokes of genius on here, like when he's talking about how his girlfriend is argumentative and he says, "Girl, why you gotta know everything, you ain't Nardwar?" Which, I mean, I love a shout out for my boy Nardwar, but that's a bad line. That is a terrible line. I honestly think that might go up there with the classic Drake, "Girl, you a lesbian, me too" line as just some of the most bafflingly bad lyricism ever in the past few years. I just can't get over the fact that Macklemore does actually, like, genuinely call out other rappers like he is saying something important and relevant to the world right now. He is absolutely not. There are some lines on here that are reminiscent of the classic Mac Lethal mumble rappers versus lyricist line where he's like, "I'm crazy as a short lady trying to give birth to 84 babies." There's some lyrics on here that are only like a step or two away from that. Not quite as bad, but like an inch maybe. Ben is an album that tries to be genuine, and I respect it for that. And it is ultimately genuine in the end. It just falls short in every single way that it could creatively, and that heartfelt honesty just completely is nullified to the fullest extent that it could be. I'm going to give this record 2 stars out of 5. Young Nudie, Gumbo. Very strong southern trap record. I think that Young Nudie actually really proves himself to be a pretty strong song composer here, as a lot of the hooks and different bridges happen to be pretty catchy, pretty memorable, pretty distinct from one another, and Nudie himself has a pretty laid-back energy that I can really get behind. It's super easy to connect with him as a personality on this record, so I highly recommend this if you're into southern trap or even cloud rap, as there are some of those influences in that general realm and ballpark that are found here as well. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Alice Longyou Gao. Let's hope heteros fail, learn, and retire. There has never been a more iconic EP title in the history of EPs. Combining highly experimental pop music with more industrial sounds isn't necessarily the most rare thing in the world when you take the success of artists like Poppy and their semi-mainstream presence into account, but Alice Longyou Gao's take on this particular sonic aesthetic is probably more successful than any other take on it that I've ever heard, if I'm being totally honest. The hyperpop moments here are incredibly fun, like infectiously enjoyable, and the metal moments here are honestly more heavy and vicious than a lot of just straightforward metal bands out there today. And the fact that it's being presented on an album called Let's Hope Heteros Fail, Learn, and Retire is absolutely hilarious, because this is far and away one of the best EPs I've heard all year. I won't be surprised if this cracks my top 5 or even top 3 EPs of the year once I get around to making that list at like the end of December of this year. My point is, it's phenomenal, it's almost mind-blowingly creative at times, and it's just a fantastic EP that you really need to hear, if not just to say that you've heard it. It's something different for sure. I'm going to give this record 4 stars out of 5. Ginger Bee, Our Skies Smile. This is the debut album from the Ginger Bee project, and honestly, I think that this is probably the single most unique and well-balanced example that you can find of DIY indie pop being mixed with screamo out there. I think that there are some other artists that do that, of course, but I don't know if I've ever really heard it as definitive as it is here. This is a record that is incredibly impressive, even if it is kind of brief. Our Sky's Smile is just so unique in its own way. I mean, the vocal work is powerful in every single moment that it's there. You have the instrumentation, which can feel just as striking as it does nostalgia-inducing, despite all of the chaos of the record and a lot of the more noisy moments that make up the majority of the EP. I really do hope that Ginger Bee put out a full length in the relatively near future, because this EP shows a major amount of potential. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. RXK Nephew, Till I'm Dead. RXK Nephew is back, and he's just as him as ever. If you know anything about the man, you surely are aware that he just perfectly walks the line between genius and just the complete bottom of the barrel, just the lowest common denominator, and that can be a beautiful thing when it works out. I mean, you've got lyrics on here like, "Don't judge me, you ain't God, bitch, I drink how I want. This Henny bottle I'm drinking on is the size of Lil Pump," which is just so ridiculous and amazing at the same time that somehow works, that line being from Neff vs. the Universe. And there are other moments here, like his rant at the end of the song Two Tone about the Will Smith, Chris Rock, Oscar slap, where it's just so nonsensical and completely pointless, but still filled with enough energy that Neff just kind of makes it work when obviously it should not and absolutely would not for probably any other rapper. It's great. The album itself is actually a bit bloated, and it doesn't really need to run for nearly an hour, considering it has a pretty singular trap-based sound throughout its entire runtime, but nonetheless, really strong release. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Unknown Mortal Orchestra, 5. The latest effort from the ever-evolving neo-psychedelic band UMO, or Unknown Mortal Orchestra, and unfortunately I'm just not feeling this one in the way I was hoping to. The album does have some interesting sonic qualities, and I can get behind some of the more jazzy and groovy moments, especially those on songs like The Widow, but at the same time, a lot of this record doesn't really expand upon those sounds. A lot of the tracks here just sound like trippier takes on laid-back, old-school, semi-mainstream pop music, and frankly, I was just hoping for a little bit more dynamicism than that. Ruben Nielsen's vocals also don't really do anything for me here. I mean, he just kind of sounds unenthused, and while I understand how that's meant to go along with the mellow vibe of the record as a whole, it still isn't something that I really enjoy. In fact, the main instrumental standout here for me, at least, is Cody Nielsen, the drummer of Unknown Mortal Orchestra, where I feel like even though he's been a bit contentious in terms of the more moist drum tone that's found throughout this entire record, I think that his style of performance actually suits those more tropical tones, and I really think he's the only standout member on the entirety of the record, whereas the rest of Unknown Mortal Orchestra just sort of plays, and that's it. And that's not a bad thing, but it also doesn't make for an exciting record. Overall, this album's just too long, too unremarkable, and doesn't really have a huge impact on me, even though I do admire, understand, and appreciate what it's trying to do. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. Lil Pump. Lil Pump 2. Oh god, there's a sequel. The latest from Lil Pump is about what you would expect. I mean, some of the instrumentals are kind of fun, but Pump is just as annoying and obnoxious as ever. You know. I also don't really expect great songwriting from Lil Pump because obviously that's not really what his music is meant for, but there are certain lines on here about like him going to the doctor because he has gonorrhea, and I don't really care how you take that, like metaphorically or literally. I don't want to hear about that, man. I straight up do not want to hear about that. I would say that, like many people have been saying, the main negative highlight here is the awful rap rock, trap metal track, pump rock, heavy metal. It's pretty infamous. It's pretty horrible. It's probably one of the worst songs of the year so far. It's everything wrong with rap rock. It makes Limp Bizkit look like the Beatles in comparison. Maybe it's just because I have like zero expectations for anything that Lil Pump is affiliated with ever, but I honestly don't think this is the worst album of the year so far or anything, even though it is awful. Don't get me wrong. Do not think that I enjoyed a Lil Pump record. I did not. But it's just what I expect from him, you know? Also on Rate Your Music, there's a genre attached to this album called No Melody, and if that isn't just the peak of music nerd community fandom, then I don't know what is. I'm going to give this record 1.5 stars out of 5. Hozier, Eat Your Young. Eat Your Young is the EP leading up to the third Hozier studio album, Unreal Unearthed, later this year, and this, to me, just kind of doesn't feel like anything. His romanticism revival lyrical style feels unfortunately kind of downgraded here, and that's a big downgrade considering that was kind of the main appeal to him in many ways, and the production just feels too glossy and flat. All I can say is that 2014 Tumblr's favorite real-life sexy man is not doing too hot here, and I hope that the album's better. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. Marussia, Knocknuri. This is a really interesting, unique EP, kind of like neo-psychedelic, jazzy, post-punk. It's kind of hard to describe, and I can't really say a lot about it. Really, the only reason I'm talking about it is because I feel obligated, because a bunch of music nerds are circle jerking about it, so I feel like I have to circle jerk about it too. But yeah, I think it's good. I enjoy it. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Lankum, False Lankum. This is the latest effort from the Irish avant folk group Lankum, and once again they've managed to combine Irish folk traditionalism with contemporary experimentalism extremely well, with this sort of sinister atmosphere found on tracks like Clear Away in the Morning that really does just hit the listener hard. It's a very powerful and downright moving record at times, sometimes in the way of being beautiful and sometimes in the way of being utterly terrifying. The instrumentation here is great as well, as it's sort of semi-virtuosic in a way in regards to the way that the different musicians in the group can accurately recreate these traditionalistic performance styles while still, again, maintaining a very modern taste and general take on things. I also think that the harsh noise wall that kind of ends out the record on a 12-minute long song is pretty well executed and puts a nice bow on things. I will say that the slightly brighter than average sounding The New York Trader does kind of sound a bit out of place, just slapdash in the middle of the album, but it's still a great song when taken out of a differing atmosphere that's placed in via this record's track list, and it isn't a big enough blemish to really throw off the entire record permanently. It still manages to recover pretty quickly, and again, it manages to maintain a pretty solid atmosphere outside of that one song. I'm going to give this record 4 stars out of 5. Black, Since I Have a Lover. This is the first full-length LP from Black ever since 2018's East Atlanta Love Letter, and hey, it's not half bad. The better tracks here tend to be the more energetic cuts, such as the 1-2 punch of Inwood Hill Park and the title track towards the beginning of the record, and Black's vocal work is consistently pretty solid throughout the entirety of the record, even if he doesn't have some sort of mind-blowing presence on the album or anything like that. If there was one major criticism that I actually could make about this record, it's that some tracks just don't really stand out in the field of modern-day contemporary R&B, especially trap-influenced R&B. I mean, for example, I don't remember a song like Tit for Tat all that well, even though I know for a fact I've heard it multiple times. I can't recite you a line or the chorus or anything like that, and unfortunately, towards the end of the record, it does begin to dip into mediocrity before finally actually redeeming itself with the very strong album closing track, NRH, and overall, it's a solid album. It may not be perfect, but it's worth a spin if you have the chance. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. Navy Blue, Ways of Knowing. Via albums like Song of Sage, Post-Panic, as well as Navy's Reprise, Navy Blue has quickly cemented himself as one of the most necessary conscious rappers of the decade so far, and it's not hard to see why. I mean, the guy holds himself to a consistently high and consistently met standard of songwriting, and here he does do that, but unfortunately the record itself is just kind of boring. The instrumentals feel a bit like cookie-cutter jazz and soul-influenced beats, which just don't stand out enough in the underground of hip-hop where there are tons of instrumentals like that, and Navy Blue never really breaks up a relatively monotonous flow over the course of Ways of Knowing's 37-minute runtime, making for a pretty unremarkable album, unfortunately, even if the songwriting is strong. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. Owl City, Coco Moon. Here I am reviewing Owl City album. This is not something I thought I would ever do on this channel. Adam Young, aka the man behind Owl City, aka the man behind the all-time classic Fireflies, and by classic, I mean classic shitpost, is back with another album, and it is music. It is so music. I don't think I hate this as much as some do, just because I've been violently exposed to like 2010 synth pop of this particular variety enough in my lifetime that it doesn't really have a nostalgia factor for me, but it doesn't upset me either. But yeah, this isn't good either. The songwriting is uncharmingly childlike. The instrumentals are so synthetic and not in a good way either. They just lack life. Adam Young's vocals are so aggressively lacking in range. Everything here just sounds like a mid to late 2000s ringtone in terms of actual presentation. It's Owl City. I'm going to give this record 1.5 stars out of 5. Ada Rook, Rookie's Bustle. Ada Rook's membership in black dresses has always kind of disappointed me. I mean, that duo's work is generally very beloved within industrial music scenes, but I'm just not that into it myself, which is why I'm glad that I really like this EP. The entire EP just starts out very strong, and it progressively gets better and better, with Sabotage Everything easily being one of the best electro-industrial adjacent songs I've heard in a good while, and I think that this is a highly recommendable EP, even if you aren't a person that's really into black dresses. I mean, I know I'm not, but Rookie's Bustle is pretty great. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Deerhoof, Miracle Level. Deerhoof are indie icons for a reason. I mean, their overall discography may not be the best above all else or anything like that, but their style has remained charming years and years after their debut, and what people generally consider to be the peak of their Pitchfork-esque popularity. And, I mean, hey, it's 2023 and they're still going strong, still putting out good stuff. They sound fresh, they sound energetic, Saitomi Matsuzaki's vocals are still extremely pleasant, and generally speaking, this is just a really, really good indie pop rock album. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. James Holden, imagine this is a high-dimensional space of all possibilities. This is another very, very good solo album from James Holden, electronic music producer, composer, and this has all the atmosphere that one would expect of someone like him, whereas the pastel, cutesy album art is accurately reflected in the actual tone of the music, with this semi-nostalgic and generally very emotional brand of electronic composition. The production here from Holden, as well as Eric James's mastering, are essential to the success of the record's atmosphere. Everything feels spread apart nicely so that it's not a dense wall of sound kind of album, but at the same time, everything manages to stand out without being thin in terms of actual audio quality. Good stuff. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Chloe, In Pieces. This is the first ever full-length solo album from Chloe of Chloe and Holly fame, and honestly, it just kind of exists, I won't lie. I mean, the production is mediocre, her vocals are fine, well done, I suppose, she performs well enough, and I guess there's a couple of songs like Cheap Back that are mildly catchy. Honestly, the only major criticism I have about this record is that there's a Chris Brown feature on How Does It Feel, which, like, really? Are we letting Chris Brown exist in 2023? Is that a thing we're allowing to happen? I would hope not, but apparently we are. Yeah, there's just really nothing going on here. I'm going to give this record 2.5 stars out of 5. Melanie Martinez. Portals. Ignoring the fact that Melanie Martinez is a terrible person who should be condemned for her actions, she also makes awful music, so, you know, she's got that going for her. The album itself focuses in on the semi-conceptual idea of rebirth, or as Martinez herself put it, in-between phase of life and death, and I do appreciate the creative ambition here, but just like not a single part of it works in the end. The instrumentals are tremendously boring alternative pop with no sense of identity in any way. Melanie's vocals are frail and weak even in moments where she needs to have way more presence than she actually does, and the songwriting here isn't really like provocative or, you know, really thought-provoking or anything that I think she thinks it is. It feels like shitty half-poetry word walls from Tumblr circa the mid-2010s, and I guess in some ways some people can see that as a positive thing. I do not. I do not see that as a positive thing. It is terrible. Portals is Melanie Martinez trying to make something universally relatable. I think. I'm assuming. But the thing is that she's never been further away from truly being the off-the-walls, crazy, weird artist that she's been trying to be since day one, and it just feels so forced and so cringe, just like it always has. At least she stopped doing the baby stuff, though, because that was kind of creepy, and just like kind of brings me back to the R. Kelly Martinez line. I'm going to give this record 1.5 stars out of 5. Larry June and The Alchemist. The Great Escape. This is a pretty decent collaboration overall, but the general balance between the two credited artists is just a touch uneven, to say the least. I mean, if I'm being totally honest, Larry June is a reasonably uninteresting MC that only really works in context of storytelling tracks where he can really shine in the lyrical aspect on songs like Ocean Sounds. Meanwhile, you have The Alchemist, one of the great producers of any genre of music today, putting out a variety of instrumentals that are all equally great, ranging from more straightforward jazz rap to an abstract take on boom bap, all of which really just are phenomenal. Thankfully, even though June is a bit of a disappointment in terms of the primary credited performer here, there are also plenty of different featured artists that are just as good, if not significantly better than him the vast majority of the time. Action Bronson, Joey Badass, Boldy James, among others, all appearing here to just really outshine June in every way, while The Alchemist provides, again, fantastic production and beats. I really don't think that this is a proper Larry June album because he just does not bring his best to the table here, but ultimately, because of everything else, this is still a decent record. It's kind of weird, but hey, it's still enjoyable, so I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is every single album I've heard from January, February, and March of 2023 that I wanted to hear and I wanted to talk about, that I did hear, but then I didn't talk about because time restraints or like me not feeling up to it. I've gotten sick like twice this year and been just like a slump, and that's the rapid record recap. Hope you liked it. I am so burnt out. This is the longest video I've ever done, and I have even more to talk about in the next entry where I cover the following 3 months, and then after that I do one for July, and then I'm good. Then I'm caught up. But with that being said, that is the end of the Rapid Record Recap. I have been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.